In late September 1984, a man climbed the stairs to his mother's flat in Partick, Glasgow. He had done it 100 times before. This time, before he even reached the door, something felt wrong. The hall light was on, and there was a smell seeping out under the letterbox. He called her name. No answer. The smell got worse the closer he stood to the door. At some point, he stopped, hoping she was just asleep. He forced the door open and stepped into a silence that had been waiting for 6 days. Inside, he found his mother, Mary McLaughlin, lying on her bed. She was 58 years old, a mother of 11, a grandmother, a woman who loved a drink, a game of dominoes, and a night out with friends. Now she was still. Around her neck, the belt from her dressing gown. For most true crime shows, this is where the story begins and ends. The body, the scene, the mystery. But for Mary's family, that moment was not a scene. It was the line that split their lives into a before and an after. To understand why this case haunted Glasgow for more than 36 years, we have to go back 6 days. Back to a Wednesday night in the West End. Back to a woman who still thought she had time. On the 26th of September 1984, Mary did something completely ordinary. She went out. Friends saw her in local pubs, chatting, laughing, playing dominoes. She was social, open, and well-known. This was not a woman hiding from the world. At about 11:15 that night, she left one of those bars and walked toward a chip shop. Witnesses later remembered a thin, dark-haired man near her on the street. But in that moment, it was just a woman heading home with food, planning to sleep in her own bed. Mary lived in a flat in Crathy Court on Laurel Street in Partick. She had a pattern. Go out, see friends, come home, lock the door. No one recalled her talking about a specific threat. She was trusting, sometimes too trusting. The sort of person who might invite someone up for one more drink. Visual suggestion. Exterior of a Glasgow tenement block at night. One lit window standing out. Somewhere between leaving the bar and her son opening that door, 6 days later, the pattern broke. We do not know whether she let her killer in with a smile, or whether he pushed past her at the threshold. We only know how the night ended. Mary strangled in her own bedroom. When police arrived, they did not walk into a neat puzzle. They faced a third-floor flat, a body several days old, no obvious signs of forced entry, and a woman whose social life had brought her into contact with a lot of people. The forensics of 1984 were limited. Officers documented what they could and made a quiet list of what felt wrong. One detail stood out. On the floor was a cigarette end from a brand Mary did not smoke. It sat there like a foreign object in her routine. They bagged it, logged it, and moved on. It would matter later. In the 1980s, there was no national DNA database. Fingerprints were useful only if you already had someone to compare them to. So detectives did what detectives did in that era. They canvassed, they interviewed, and they tried to build a picture of Mary's last known hours. Police spoke to more than 1,000 people. Friends, neighbors, bar staff, regulars, anyone who might have seen Mary or the thin man near her that night. They built timelines of who left which bar, when, and who walked which route home. What they got back was not clarity, but blur. There was no obvious ex-partner, no jealous current partner with torn knuckles, no confession, just a dead woman in a flat with a dressing gown belt around her neck and a cigarette that did not belong to her. The case began to cool even as grief was still fresh. Mary's body revealed some truths. She had been strangled. The belt had been pulled tight around her neck. There was no smashed door or broken lock. Whoever killed her either knocked and was let in, or had the kind of access that did not need a break-in. Police kept the scene in mind. If this had happened today, you might expect crime scene swabs and rapid DNA hits. In 1984, that world did not exist. The best the team could do was to preserve anything that might be important later. The belt, her clothing, that one cigarette end that did not fit. Time moved on. Files stayed open, but leads dried up. There were other crimes, other victims, and limited resources. Mary's family lived in a long, quiet waiting room. They knew she had been murdered. They did not know who had done it, or if he was still walking their streets. In the background, the man who would one day be convicted of her murder already existed in the system. His name was Graham McGill. In 1981, he had been sentenced to 6 years in prison for an attack with intent to rape. His violence was not a secret to the courts. At the time Mary died, McGill was meant to be serving that sentence at HMP Edinburgh. On paper, that looked like the kind of fact that ends a line of inquiry. If your suspect is behind bars, how can he be in a Glasgow flat on a Wednesday night? On paper, it sounded solid. But prison records, like crime scenes, are rarely as simple as one sentence. Scotland was running a scheme called Training for Freedom. Certain prisoners were allowed out on temporary release to prepare for life after jail. McGill was one of those prisoners. That meant that on the very night Mary walked back from the pub, McGill was not necessarily locked behind a cell door. He could be out, moving through the same city streets, drinking in the same bars, walking past the same chip shop. But at the time, that nuance went unseen. When detectives first considered him, the phrase "he was in prison at the time" worked like a shield. It made people stop asking questions. The alibi sounded almost too good to argue with. So the investigation drifted toward other possibilities, and then, slowly, into the background. Mary's murder became one of those stories a city remembers. A trusting woman killed in her own home. A son forced to break down the door. A dressing gown belt that became a ligature. A cigarette butt in an evidence box that nobody knew what to do with. In 1999, McGill was jailed for life for another offense, again involving violence against a woman. He would later be released on license. Mary's case, meanwhile, stayed unsolved. The people who loved her carried that fact into middle age and then into old age. Then the science changed. In the 2010s, Police Scotland began a review of old unsolved murders. Mary's case was pulled from the shelves and moved into a different kind of room. Not an interview room this time, but a modern forensic lab with new tools and new eyes. A forensic biologist named Joanne Cochran re-examined the physical evidence: Mary's dress, the belt from her dressing gown, the cigarette end that had never belonged in that flat. The question was simple. Can we get anything more from this now than we could 30 years ago? On the inside of the knot in the ligature around Mary's neck, she found DNA that did not belong to Mary. The same male profile appeared on Mary's dress and on the cigarette end that had been saved all those years. The faint marks that had once been invisible finally came into focus. When that DNA profile was run through the national database, it matched a name: Graham McGill, a man with a known history of sexual violence, a man once looked at and then set aside because of an alibi no one had fully tested, now tied to the scene in 3 separate places. At first, an old problem remained. How do you match a murder to a man who, according to the simple version of his record, was supposed to be in prison? DNA does not come with a timestamp. It cannot tell you what else happened in the room. The science raised the question. It did not yet answer it. Detectives went back to the paperwork, this time reading it as carefully as they had read the lab reports. In the archives, they found the detail that had been missing from the story for decades. McGill had been granted temporary release under Training for Freedom, including weekends. Those release dates lined up with the period when Mary was killed. It turned out the alibi had never truly been airtight. It had simply never been examined hard enough. Once that sentence cracked, the outline of the case changed. A new shape stepped out of the file. A vulnerable woman, last seen leaving pubs and heading home. A convicted sexual offender on release the same week. His DNA found on the ligature around her neck, on her clothing, and on the cigarette end inside her flat. The pattern was suddenly harder to ignore. In December 2019, more than 35 years after Mary's death, police arrested Graham McGill and charged him with her murder. He denied it. He claimed that whatever contact had happened between them did not include killing her. The jury would have to decide. The trial opened in 2021 at the High Court in Glasgow. Jurors heard about Mary's last night out, the pubs, the dominoes, witnesses who described her as friendly and trusting. They heard from her son about the smell at the door and the moment he found her. They also heard from the forensic experts how the belt had been kept, how earlier testing had been limited, how modern DNA methods finally pulled McGill's profile from inside the knot of the dressing gown cord and from other items in the flat. The science rewrote the scene. The defense reminded the jury that DNA alone cannot show motive or timing. They argued that it could not, by itself, prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. They pointed to the fact that eyewitness descriptions of the man seen with Mary that night were not perfect matches for McGill. The prosecution showed McGill's pattern of violence against women. They set Mary's trusting nature against his record. They highlighted the belt from her own dressing gown, the absence of forced entry, and the cigarette end from a brand she did not smoke. They argued that McGill had met Mary on her night out, gone back with her to the flat, and then killed her there, leaving traces of himself on the objects he handled, including the weapon he used to strangle her. The DNA, they said, did not just float into that room. They also read out statements from Mary's family, describing the hole left in their lives and the long wait for answers. For them, this was not an interesting cold case. It was the question that had sat in the background of every Christmas, every birthday, every ordinary day. After hearing everything, the jury retired. They did not take long. Just over 2 hours later, they returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty. In May 2021, the judge sentenced McGill to life in prison, with a minimum term of 14 years before he can seek release. For Mary's family, it was not a happy ending. There is nothing happy about learning the details of how your mother died 3 decades after the fact, but it was an ending with a name. The vague shape of some man became a specific person they could point to in court. There are still questions this case will never fully answer. What exactly happened in the flat between the moment Mary walked through her door and the moment she died? How long she was alone with her killer? Whether there were warning signs that simply looked ordinary at the time? Those answers are locked inside a single night in 1984 that only 2 people truly witnessed. One of them is dead. One of them has every reason to leave the details buried. The best the system can do is to draw the outline from what is left in the evidence. At its heart, this case sits where human trust, system gaps, and slow science meet. Mary trusted people. The system trusted the sentence. He was in prison at the time, and in the end, it was science that refused to trust any of it and went back to a cigarette end on a flat floor. Cold cases are often presented as puzzles waiting for a clever twist. In reality, they are more like unfinished sentences. A life that stops mid-story. A family forced to live around a blank space where the final line should be. For Mary McLaughlin's family, that line finally arrived. The man who killed her has been named and convicted. It does not undo the night in 1984. It does not give them back the years without answers. But it closes the question of who, even if it cannot fully answer why. When you hear someone talk about a perfect alibi, remember this case. Ask who decided it was perfect when it was last checked and what assumptions were hiding underneath. Sometimes a single unchecked line can stall justice for half a lifetime. And when you hear Mary's name, remember she was not just a victim in a documentary. She was a mother, a grandmother, someone who liked dominoes and noisy nights in Glasgow pubs, and she should have been allowed to grow old. Her story sat in a box for 36 years. It is not in that box anymore.